was a time when the Earth belonged to a world we no longer remember. Not forgotten in the way ruins are forgotten, buried beneath soil waiting to be uncovered, but erased in a deeper sense. A world whose logic, whose rhythms, whose very identity have no direct descendant in the landscapes we know today. If you could stand upon its surface nearly 300 million years in the past, you would not recognize it as Earth at all. The continents now scattered across the globe were fused into a single colossal landmass, Pangaea. It stretched from pole to pole, an unbroken expanse of land so vast that it altered the very behavior of the planet's atmosphere. Around it lay a single encircling ocean, Pangaea, deeper and more immense than any ocean that exists today. There were no familiar coastlines, no Atlantic, no Pacific as we know them. Only one endless shoreline where land met water, and beyond it a horizon that seemed to curve into eternity. The Earth itself felt larger then, not in size but in presence. The interior of Pangaea was a place of extremes. Far from the moderating influence of the ocean, the climate shifted violently between seasons. Summers burned under relentless sunlight, baking the land into vast deserts. Winters brought sudden cold, sharp and unforgiving. Rainfall was scarce in these central regions, and life, where it persisted, clung to existence with quiet resilience. Yet along the margins, near the coasts, along river basins and in low-lying floodplains, the world softened. Here, life flourished. Forests stretched across the land, but they were not forests as we would recognize them. There were no flowering plants, no grasses swaying in the wind. Instead, the landscape was dominated by ancient forms, towering conifers, dense thickets of seed ferns, and strange, rigid plants whose evolutionary lineage would one day vanish entirely. Their leaves were thick, their structures efficient, adapted to a world where water could not always be trusted. The air carried a different scent, heavy with resin, damp soil, and the slow chemistry of a planet still shaping itself. Rivers carved their way through the land in long, winding paths, fed by seasonal rains and distant highlands. Some spread into vast floodplains, creating temporary wetlands that teemed with life before retreating again into dryness. Others cut deep channels, exposing layers of ancient sediment, a record of time stretching far beyond human comprehension. Above, the sky was familiar yet subtly altered. Oxygen levels fluctuated during this era, shaping how organisms breathed, how they moved, how they survived. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was different enough that every breath, every heartbeat would feel slightly out of place to a modern human. And still, despite all of this, despite the harsh interiors, the unstable climate, the unfamiliar air, life did not merely endure, it prospered. This was the Permian period, a chapter of Earth's history that followed hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. By this point, life had already conquered the oceans, ventured onto land, and diversified into complex ecosystems. This was not a beginning. It was a culmination. The land was alive with movement. Creatures walked, hunted, burrowed, and fed beneath the canopy of ancient trees. Insects moved through the undergrowth, some larger than their modern descendants, their forms shaped by an atmosphere that allowed for different possibilities. Amphibians lingered near water, while more advanced terrestrial animals roamed farther inland, no longer bound to rivers or swamps for survival. The ecosystems were intricate, balanced through countless interactions, predator and prey, growth and decay, competition and adaptation. Every organism occupied a place within a system that had been refined over millions of years. Nothing about this world suggested fragility. Nothing hinted at an ending. If you were to observe it without knowledge of what lay ahead, you would see a planet in equilibrium, a world that had already found its rhythm. Life had solved the problem of survival on land. It had diversified, specialized, and spread across nearly every available niche. Evolution, in this moment, did not feel like a force of upheaval, but one of refinement. Adjusting, perfecting, stabilizing. It would be easy to believe that this was how things would continue, that the dominant forms of life would persist, adapting slowly as the planet changed around them, that the great patterns of this era would extend forward into the future, shaping whatever came next. But beneath the surface of this apparent stability, deeper forces were at work. The continents, though united, were not still. Beneath Pangaea, the mantle, shifted currents of molten rock moving slowly but inexorably. Pressure built in regions unseen far below the crust. The planet's interior, restless and immense, was preparing for something that life on the surface could neither predict nor prevent. And within the ecosystems themselves there existed another kind of tension, not visible in any single moment, but present in the structure of the system as a whole. A world so interconnected, so dependent on balance, carries within it a hidden vulnerability. When conditions remain stable, complexity thrives. But when those conditions change, and even slightly, complexity can become a liability. The more intricate the system, the more ways it can fail. And the Permian world was, in many ways, the most intricate the Earth had ever seen. It had reached a level of biological sophistication unmatched in its time. Species were no longer simple generalists. They were specialists, finely tuned to specific environments, specific climates, specific relationships within the ecosystem. They were successful, but they were also exposed. Because a world built on balance is a world that can be unbalanced. There is a quiet paradox here. Life had not only adapted to the planet, it had adapted to a very particular version of the planet, a specific range of temperatures, a specific atmospheric composition, a specific arrangement of land and sea. Change those conditions and the adaptations that once ensured survival could become limitations. And so, beneath the forests, beneath the rivers, beneath the seemingly stable surface of this ancient Earth, the stage was already set, not for gradual transformation, but for something far more abrupt. For now, though, the Permian world remained whole. The forests still stood, the rivers still flowed. The creatures of this age moved through their environments with the quiet confidence of dominance, unaware that they were living at the edge of one of the most profound turning points in the history of life. A world complete in itself, a world that needed nothing more. And yet, for reasons written deep within the planet's own machinery, it would not last. Stay with us until the end of this journey into the primitive world. The surface of this ancient Earth was not merely a landscape of forests and rivers, it was a proving ground. Because something extraordinary had already happened. Something so fundamental that it would shape every future form of complex life. Life had broken free from water, not in tentative steps, not in fragile experiments, but decisively. The age of dependence on swamps and shorelines was fading. The old rulers of the Carboniferous, the great amphibians bound to moisture, tied to the rhythm of rivers and wetlands, were giving way to something new, something independent, something that could carry its world within itself. The key to this transformation was subtle, almost invisible, a biological innovation that changed everything, the amniotic egg. No longer did life need to return to water to reproduce. No longer were early life stages exposed to drying air or shifting climates. With this single adaptation, vertebrates unlocked the continents. And once that door opened, evolution moved quickly. Across the vast stretches of Pangaea, creatures began to spread into territories that had once been unreachable. Deep interiors, arid plains, seasonal environments where water was scarce and unpredictable. Life was no longer confined to the edges of rivers. It could move with the climate, endure it, even exploit it. This was not merely expansion, it was liberation. And from this liberation, two great lineages emerged, diverging quietly at first, but destined to shape the future in profoundly different ways. On one side were the synapsids, on the other the sauropsids. At a glance, they may have appeared similar. Both descended from early amniotes, both adapted to life on land, both equipped with the tools needed to survive in a changing world. But beneath the surface, their paths were already beginning to diverge. The distinction was written into the architecture of their skulls, into the way their muscles attached, into the very mechanics of how they bit, moved, and breathed. Subtle differences at first, but evolution tends to amplify such differences over time. And in the Permian world, it was the synapsids who surged ahead. They became the dominant presence across much of the land, not because they were merely numerous, but because they were versatile. They adapted to a wide range of environments, from arid interiors to more temperate regions near the coasts. They evolved into predators, herbivores, scavengers, filling ecological roles with increasing specialization. They were, in many ways, the first true masters of the land. To modernize, they would appear strange, familiar in fragments, but assembled in ways that defy expectation. Limbs sprawled to the sides, yet capable of powerful movement. Skulls that hinted at features we would later associate with mammals, yet still carried the unmistakable marks of their ancient origins. They were not quite reptiles, not quite mammals, but something in between. Something transitional and yet fully realized in their own time. Within their ranks, diversity flourished. Some grew large and imposing, dominating their environments with sheer presence. Others remained small, agile, capable of navigating complex terrains or surviving in harsher conditions. Their physiology began to experiment with new strategies, more efficient feeding mechanisms, improved mobility, perhaps even early steps toward regulating body temperature in ways that would later define mammals. There is evidence, subtle but compelling, that some synapsids may have possessed higher metabolic rates than their contemporaries. If true, this would have given them a significant advantage: greater endurance, more sustained activity, the ability to function in a wider range of conditions. They were not just surviving, they were advancing. Meanwhile, the sauropsids, the lineage that would one day give rise to reptiles, birds, and dinosaurs, remained present but less dominant. They occupied niches, adapted in their own ways, but did not yet command the same ecological authority. If you were to observe this world without knowledge of what lay ahead, you would likely assume that the future belonged to the synapsids. They had momentum. They had diversity. They had begun to explore evolutionary pathways that hinted at increasing complexity, pathways that in time would lead toward mammals. And so, in a quiet, unspoken way, the direction of life on Earth seemed set. The great experiment of land-based life had produced its leaders. The system was stabilizing around them. But evolution is not guided by intention. It does not plan. It does not favor one lineage because it appears more advanced, more adaptable, or more promising. It responds to conditions, and conditions on this ancient Earth were far from constant. Across Pangaea, environments remained unpredictable. The vast interior deserts imposed limits on how far even the most adaptable species could spread. Seasonal extremes forced continual adjustment. Droughts, floods, temperature swings, all acted as pressures, shaping the trajectory of life in ways both visible and unseen. In this sense, the dominance of the synapsids was not absolute. It was contingent. They thrived under the conditions that existed. But those conditions were only one version of what the Earth could be. And beneath it all, the deeper systems of the planet continued to shift. The continents, though unified, were under tension. The crust flexed and strained. Heat accumulated below the surface, moving slowly and visibly through the mantle. These processes were beyond the reach of biology, beyond adaptation, beyond survival strategies. They belonged to the planet itself, and the planet was not finished changing. Still, on the surface, life continued its quiet expansion. Ecosystems grew more intricate. Food webs extended, connecting species in complex networks of dependency. Predators refined their hunting strategies. Herbivores adapted to increasingly tough vegetation. Competition drove innovation, pushing species into new niches, new forms, new possibilities. There is a kind of confidence that emerges in such systems. Not conscious, not deliberate, but embedded in the structure of life itself. When a lineage dominates, when it spreads across continents and persists through changing conditions, it begins to feel, from the outside, inevitable, as though it cannot be displaced, as though it represents the endpoint of evolution's current path. The synapsids carried that weight. They were not just participants in the Permian world. They were its defining feature. And yet, even as they expanded, even as they diversified and strengthened their hold on the land, there remained an underlying fragility. Because dominance does not guarantee permanence. In fact, it can create its own kind of vulnerability. The more a lineage spreads, the more it becomes tied to the stability of the systems it inhabits. The more specialized it becomes, the more dependent it is on specific conditions remaining within certain bounds. And if those bounds are crossed, adaptation may not be enough. There is a quiet irony here. The very success of the synapsids, their ability to conquer the land, to diversify, to become the central actors in this ancient world, also positioned them at the center of whatever would come next. They had the most to gain and the most to lose. For now, though, the balance held. Across Pangaea, under skies both familiar and alien, the first masters of land moved through their world with a kind of unchallenged authority. They hunted, fed, reproduced, and spread, unaware that their era, so vast by human standards, so enduring in its own time, was only one chapter in a much longer story. A story that had not yet revealed its turning point. A story in which dominance could vanish, and in which the future, however certain it seemed, could be rewritten without warning. Along the margins of ancient rivers where water carved its way through the dry heart of Pangaea, something moved with deliberate precision. Low to the ground, yet powerful. Its body stretched long and muscular, its limbs splayed outward in a posture that seemed primitive by modern standards, yet perfectly suited to its time. And rising from its back, an unmistakable silhouette, a tall, thin sail of bone and skin catching the light of a harsher sun. This was Dimetrodon. It waited near the water's edge, where life gathered. Amphibians still clung to these places, and smaller terrestrial animals came to drink. The river was a boundary between worlds, and Dimetrodon understood it. Its sail, often mistaken as decoration by the modern eye, was something far more functional. A structure of elongated vertebrae threaded with blood vessels, it acted as a regulator, absorbing heat in the cool of morning, releasing it when temperatures climbed too high. In a world of extremes, this gave Dimetrodon an advantage. It could become active earlier, stay active longer, hunt when others could not. Its jaws told another story. Lined with differentiated teeth, some sharp for tearing, others designed for gripping, it represented a step forward in feeding efficiency. This was not a simple predator relying on brute force. It was specialized, adapted, refined. And it was not alone. Across the same landscapes, moving more slowly but no less significantly, was a very different creature. Broad-bodied, low-slung, its sail rising like a rigid wall along its spine. But this one carried no predatory intent. Edaphosaurus, Where Dimetrodon hunted, Edaphosaurus grazed. Its jaws were lined with peg-like teeth designed not for flesh but for grinding tough, fibrous plant matter. The vegetation of the Permian was not soft. It demanded effort to consume, and Edaphosaurus was built for endurance. Its sail, too, may have served a thermoregulatory role, though its structure was different, often adorned with crossbars that gave it a more reinforced appearance. It moved through the sparse forests and floodplains, feeding steadily, converting the energy of ancient plants into something that would sustain entire food chains. Together, these creatures reveal something essential about this world. It was not simple. It was not primitive. It was already structured. Predator and prey, energy flowing through systems that had stabilized over millions of years. But these early synapsids were only the beginning. As the Permian progressed, evolution did not pause. It accelerated. New forms emerged, more advanced, more specialized. Creatures that would redefine dominance on land. Among them were the Gorgonopsids. If Dimetrodon was formidable, the Gorgonopsids were something else entirely. They stood taller, their limbs more capable of supporting their weight beneath their bodies, allowing for more efficient movement. Their skulls were elongated, their jaws powerful, and from those jaws extended one of the most striking features in all of the Permian world: elongated, saber-like canine teeth. These were not decorative. They were instruments of precision. With a single well-placed bite, a Gorgonopsid could deliver fatal damage to prey far larger than itself. Their hunting style was likely fast, decisive, an evolution away from the slower, ambush-based strategies of earlier predators. Their sensory systems, too, suggest a higher level of sophistication. Enlarged temporal openings in their skulls allowed for stronger jaw muscles, while their overall anatomy hints at improved coordination and awareness. They were, in many ways, approaching something that feels familiar, a step closer to the predators we recognize today. Across vast regions of Pangaea, the Gorgonopsids occupied the top of the food chain. There was little that could challenge them. Their presence shaped entire ecosystems, influencing where herbivores moved, how they behaved, how they survived, and those herbivores were no less remarkable. Among the most widespread were the Dicynodonts. At first glance, they seem almost improbable. Barrel-bodied with short, sturdy limbs, a beak-like mouth in place of rows of teeth, and in many species a pair of tusks extending from the upper jaw, curved, prominent, and unmistakable. But this unusual design was not a flaw. It was a solution. The beak allowed for efficient cropping of vegetation, while internal structures within the mouth likely aided in processing plant material. Their digestive systems were adapted to extract nutrients from tough, fibrous plants, a critical ability in a world where food was not always abundant or easily consumed. Dicynodonts were among the most successful herbivores of their time. They spread across continents, occupying a wide range of environments. Some were small, agile creatures. Others grew to substantial sizes, forming the backbone of terrestrial ecosystems. Where they moved, life followed. They were prey for the great predators, yes, but they were also engineers of their environment. Their feeding habits shaped vegetation patterns, their movement influenced the distribution of plant life, and their very presence supported the intricate balance of the Permian world. And beyond these well-known forms, there existed countless others. Burrowing synapsids that escaped the worst of the climate by retreating underground. Semi-aquatic species that lingered near rivers and wetlands. Smaller, more elusive creatures that occupied niches between predator and prey, feeding on insects, plants, or carrion. Each one a piece of a larger system. Each one adapted to a specific role. There is a tendency, when looking this far into the past, to imagine a world that is somehow incomplete, a prelude to something more advanced, but the Permian resists that interpretation. This was not a draft. It was not a rehearsal. It was a fully realized world operating with a level of complexity that rivals many ecosystems today. The interactions between species were dynamic and continuous. Predators influenced prey populations. Herbivores shaped vegetation. Environmental pressures drove adaptation, and adaptation in turn reshaped the environment. It was a system in motion yet balanced. And perhaps most striking of all, it worked. For millions of years, this world sustained itself. Species rose and fell, yes, but within a framework that remained stable. The dominant forms, particularly the synapsids, continued to evolve, to diversify, to expand their reach across Pangaea. There was no sign of stagnation, no indication that this trajectory would abruptly end. If anything, the direction seemed clear. The synapsids were refining traits that would later define mammals. More efficient feeding, improved mobility, possibly even early forms of metabolic regulation. Given enough time, it is not difficult to imagine them continuing along this path, becoming more advanced, more dominant, more central to the story of life on Earth. The future from this vantage point appears almost predictable. And that is what makes it so deceptive, because nothing in this world, not the strength of its predators, not the adaptability of its herbivores, not the complexity of its ecosystems, suggests vulnerability. Nothing hints at collapse. The rivers still flow, the forests still stand. The great creatures of this age still move through their territories with the quiet certainty of survival. Dimetrodon waits by the water. Edaphosaurus feeds beneath the sparse canopy. Gorgonopsids hunt across open plains. Dicynodonts wander in herds, shaping the land with every step. Life, in all its forms, continues. A complete system, a world that has already proven it can endure. And yet, beneath this apparent permanence, forces are gathering, not within the creatures themselves, but within the planet they inhabit. Because no matter how successful life becomes, it remains bound to the conditions of the world beneath it. And those conditions are beginning to change, not in a sudden, violent rupture, but in something far more insidious, a constant pressure exerted by the very shape of the world itself. The immense landmass of Pangaea did more than gather continents together. It rewrote the rules of climate. Oceans in the modern world act as regulators. They absorb heat, distribute it, soften extremes. But here, with so much land stretched across the planet's surface, that moderating influence could not reach the interior. The heart of Pangaea lay too far from the sea, and so it became a place of intensity. Inland, the landscape opened into vast deserts that stretched beyond the horizon. Not the dunes of soft sand familiar to us, but hard, sun-baked expanses where the ground cracked under relentless heat. Daylight brought searing temperatures, the sun pressing down without relief. At night, the heat dissipated quickly, leaving behind a sharp and sudden cold. The difference between day and night was not gradual, it was extreme. Seasonal shifts added another layer of instability. Summers were long and punishing, drawing moisture from the soil until the land itself seemed to dry and tighten. Winters, though shorter, could bring abrupt cooling, particularly in regions farther from the equator. Rainfall, when it came, was unpredictable. In some regions, years could pass with little precipitation at all. In others, the skies would open suddenly, releasing intense, short-lived storms that flooded dry channels and transformed the land into temporary wetlands. Rivers would swell, overflow, and then retreat just as quickly, leaving behind sediment and scattered life struggling to adapt. Near the coasts, the story was different but no less volatile. There, the influence of Panthalassa created cycles of moisture and dryness that followed patterns far more dramatic than anything seen today. Monsoon-like systems developed, driven by the temperature differences between land and sea. Warm air rising over the heated continent would draw in moist ocean air, leading to seasonal deluges. For a time, these regions would flourish. Floodplains would expand. Vegetation would grow dense and abundant, and life would surge in response. But the balance never held for long. As the seasons shifted, the rains would recede and the same landscapes would begin to dry, water sources shrinking, vegetation thinning, and the pressure of survival returning once more. This was not a gentle cycle. It was a constant oscillation between abundance and scarcity, and life across this vast and varied world was forced to respond. Some species turned inward, quite literally. Burrowing became a strategy of survival, a way to escape the worst of the heat and the cold. Beneath the surface, temperatures remained more stable, humidity more consistent. Creatures that could dig, that could retreat below ground during the harshest conditions, gained an advantage. Others adapted their bodies to manage the environment rather than escape it. Among the synapsids, including forms like Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus, structures like dorsal sails played a role in regulating body temperature. By increasing surface area and allowing blood to circulate close to the air, these animals could absorb heat quickly in cooler conditions and release it when temperatures rose. It was a delicate balance. Too much heat, and the body would overheat. Too little, and metabolic processes would slow, reducing activity, limiting survival. The ability to manage this balance, even imperfectly, became a defining trait. Other adaptations were less visible but no less significant. Respiratory systems evolved to cope with fluctuations in atmospheric composition. Oxygen levels during the Permian were not constant. They rose and fell over long timescales influenced by volcanic activity, plant growth, and the cycling of carbon through the planet's systems. For animals, this meant that breathing itself could become more or less efficient depending on the era and location. Those with more effective lungs, more efficient oxygen exchange, or the ability to tolerate lower oxygen conditions would have been better equipped to survive. Even movement was shaped by the climate. In a world where temperatures could spike rapidly, conserving energy became critical. Many creatures adopted movement patterns that minimized exertion during the hottest parts of the day, becoming more active during cooler periods, early morning, late evening, or even night. Predators adjusted their hunting strategies accordingly. Prey adapted in response. The entire rhythm of life shifted in alignment with the environment. And yet, despite all of these challenges, life did not merely endure. It adapted with remarkable success. Across deserts, floodplains, and forests, ecosystems formed that were both resilient and intricate. Species developed specialized roles, interacting with one another in ways that maintained balance even under difficult conditions. There is a tendency to associate stability with calm, with environments that change slowly, predictably. But the Permian world suggests something different. Stability here was built on adaptation to instability. Life did not rely on the environment remaining constant. It relied on its ability to respond when it did not. And for millions of years, this approach worked. The great synapsids continued to dominate. Herbivores like Dicynodonts moved across the land in search of vegetation, their bodies designed to process whatever the environment could provide. Predators like the Gorgonopsids followed, maintaining the balance between populations. The system held, but there is a quiet tension within such a system. Because adaptation, no matter how effective, has limits. Each species is tuned to a range of conditions, a spectrum within which it can survive and function. Step outside that range, and the very traits that once ensured survival can become insufficient. The Permian world existed within a narrow window of possibility. Temperature, atmospheric composition, water availability, all fluctuated, but within bounds that life had learned to navigate. The ecosystems were stable not because change did not occur, but because it did not exceed what life could handle. And that distinction matters, because it suggests that the stability of this world was conditional. It depended on the planet continuing to behave within certain limits. But the Earth is not bound by the needs of life. Its processes operate on scales and forces far beyond biology. Beneath the crust, energy accumulates, pressure builds, chemical cycles shift in response to forces that life cannot influence. And when those forces reach a threshold, the changes they produce can move faster and further than any adaptation can follow. In the Permian, that threshold was approaching. Not visible in the movement of a single creature, nor in the rise and fall of a single ecosystem, but present in the gradual alignment of deeper processes. The climate, already extreme, was sensitive. The atmosphere, already fluctuating, was vulnerable. The oceans, already dependent on delicate balances of temperature and oxygen, were exposed. From the perspective of life on the surface, the world still functioned. The rivers still flowed, the forests still grew. The great creatures of this age still moved through their environments, adapting as they always had. But the margin for error was narrowing. A world defined by extremes can endure only so much change before those extremes begin to exceed what life can tolerate. And in such a world, the difference between resilience and collapse can be surprisingly small. Beyond the restless climates of land where heat and drought shaped survival, another world unfolded beneath the surface of Pangaea, vast, layered, and teeming with life. From above, the ocean might have appeared calm, its surface stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But below it was anything but still. It was alive with motion. Sunlight filtered through the upper layers, illuminating warm, shallow seas that spread across continental margins. These regions, rich in nutrients and bathed in light, became the foundation of one of the most complex ecosystems the planet had ever known. Reefs rose from the seafloor, not identical to the coral reefs of today, but built by ancient organisms that served a similar role. Sponges, algae, and early reef-forming creatures constructed vast, rigid structures that provided shelter, hunting grounds, and breeding spaces for countless species. These reefs were not static formations. They grew, adapted, and responded to their environment, forming living architectures that could stretch for kilometers. Within and around them, life flourished. Armored forms of trilobites moved across the seabed, their segmented bodies gliding over sediment as they fed or scavenged. They had existed long before the Permian, survivors of earlier ages, and though their diversity had begun to decline, they remained a recognizable presence, a link to a deeper past. Nearby, stationary yet no less vital, were the brachiopods. Anchored to the seafloor, they opened their shells to filter nutrients from the water, quietly sustaining themselves while contributing to the broader ecological network. Their abundance was staggering. Entire stretches of ocean floor were covered with them, forming dense communities that shaped the structure of marine habitats. Fish, too, had begun to diversify. Early forms moved through the water column, some sleek and fast, others slower, adapted to specific niches. Predators pursued smaller prey in coordinated bursts of motion, while filter feeders extracted sustenance from the invisible life drifting through the currents. Above all of this, microscopic organisms and plankton zeolites formed the base of the entire system. They were unseen, yet indispensable. Through photosynthesis, they captured sunlight and converted it into energy, producing oxygen as a byproduct. This oxygen dissolved into the water, sustaining the creatures below. It was a delicate exchange, light, chemistry, biology, all interwoven. Energy flowed upward through the system, from plankton to small organisms, from small organisms to larger ones, from prey to predator. Each layer depended on the one beneath it, forming chains of interaction that extended across entire regions of ocean. It was not chaos, it was structure. An intricate web, balanced through countless relationships, each one shaped by millions of years of evolution. And for a time, it held. The oceans of the Permian were warm, particularly in shallow regions, and this warmth supported high levels of biodiversity. Nutrients circulated through currents, sustaining life even in areas far from shore. The system was dynamic, constantly adjusting yet maintaining an overall equilibrium. But beneath this apparent stability lay a fundamental truth. Marine life is not independent. It is bound, intimately, completely, to the chemistry of the water it inhabits. On land, organisms can move to escape unfavorable conditions. They can seek shade, burrow into the ground, migrate across distances. In the ocean, such options are limited. Water surrounds everything. It carries heat, gases, nutrients, and changes in any of these can spread across vast distances with little resistance. The ocean is not just an environment, it is a medium. And when that medium changes, everything within it is affected. Oxygen, for example, is not uniformly distributed throughout the ocean. It dissolves at the surface where water meets air, and is circulated downward through currents and mixing. In well-oxygenated waters, life thrives, but if this circulation slows or if oxygen is consumed faster than it can be replenished, certain regions can become depleted, anoxic. In such conditions, most complex life cannot survive. Temperature, too, plays a critical role. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water. As temperatures rise, the capacity of the ocean to support oxygen-dependent life diminishes. At the same time, metabolic rates increase, meaning organisms require more oxygen just as it becomes less available. It is a quiet contradiction, one that can push systems toward instability. Then there is the chemistry of carbon. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, forming carbonic acid. In balanced amounts, this is part of the natural cycle. But if carbon dioxide levels rise too quickly, the water becomes more acidic. This affects organisms that rely on calcium carbonate to build shells or skeletons. Creatures like brachiopods and many reef builders. Their structures weaken. Their ability to survive diminishes. The foundations of entire ecosystems begin to erode. These are not dramatic changes, not in the way a storm or a predator is dramatic. They are subtle, gradual, shifts in the underlying conditions that sustain life. And yet, their impact can be profound. Because marine ecosystems, for all their complexity, depend on a narrow range of chemical stability. Step outside that range, and the system begins to strain. Push further, and it begins to break. In the Permian oceans, all of these variables, oxygen levels, temperature, carbon, chemistry, were in a state of balance. But it was a balance maintained under specific conditions. Conditions that were not guaranteed to last. The connection between the ocean and the rest of the planet is absolute. Atmospheric composition influences ocean chemistry. Volcanic activity can alter both. Changes in temperature affect circulation patterns, which in turn affect oxygen distribution. Everything is linked, and that linkage, while allowing for the flow of energy and nutrients, also creates a pathway for disruption. A disturbance in one part of the system can propagate through the rest. At first, such disturbances might appear local. A region where oxygen levels dip slightly, an area where temperatures rise beyond the usual range. A shift in current patterns that alters nutrient flow. Life, as it had on land, could adapt to a certain degree. Species might migrate to more favorable conditions. Populations might fluctuate. Some organisms might decline while others take their place. But adaptation has limits, and the ocean, vast as it is, offers fewer refuges than one might expect. There is nowhere to hide from chemistry. As long as the balance holds, the system thrives. Reefs continue to grow, trilobites continue to move across the seabed, brachiopods continue to filter the water, fish continue to hunt and feed. The unseen plankton continue their quiet work, sustaining everything above them. But if that balance shifts, not gradually but beyond a certain threshold, the consequences would not remain contained. They would cascade, from the smallest organisms to the largest, from the surface to the depths, because in the ocean more than anywhere else, life is not just connected, it is dependent. And when the foundation of that dependency begins to change, the collapse, when it comes, does not unfold in isolation, it spreads. Time in this world does not feel like movement, it feels like continuation. Across the immense expanse of Pangaea, seasons turn, rivers shift their courses, forests expand and contract with the rhythms of climate, but the underlying structure of life remains intact. Millions of years pass, and yet the pattern holds. The great synapsids still dominate the land. The herds still move across floodplains and dry basins. Predators still follow, shaping the balance through pursuit and restraint. Beneath the surface of Pangaea, reefs continue to grow and marine ecosystems sustain their intricate networks of exchange. Nothing appears to be unraveling. If anything, it is becoming more complete. Evolution at this stage is no longer about bold experimentation. The age of crude forms and rapid divergence has given way to refinement. Traits are honed, efficiencies improved, behaviors optimized. Each generation inherits not just survival but precision. Bodies become better suited to their roles. Feeding mechanisms grow more effective. Movement becomes more coordinated, more purposeful. Even the relationships between species, predator and prey, plant and herbivore, settle into patterns that maximize stability. It is a world that has learned how to sustain itself, not in the sense that evolution has stopped, but in the sense that it has achieved balance. And balance, once established, carries with it a powerful illusion. The illusion of permanence. Because when systems endure over vast stretches of time, they begin to feel inevitable. The longer they persist, the more they appear resistant to disruption. Stability reinforces itself, creating the impression that whatever forces shaped the system have already done their work. That what exists now will continue to exist. But this impression is deceptive, because extinction does not always announce itself through decline. It does not always begin with visible weakening, with ecosystems gradually collapsing or species slowly failing. There are moments in Earth's history where life appears strongest, most diverse, most widespread, most secure, just before it is confronted with forces beyond its ability to respond. Moments where the system is not deteriorating. It is thriving, and that is precisely what makes it vulnerable. In a world of refinement, specialization becomes more pronounced. Species adapt not just to general conditions, but to very specific niches. Diets become more focused, behaviors more narrowly tuned, physiologies optimized for particular ranges of temperature, oxygen, and environment. This increases efficiency, but it also reduces flexibility. A generalist can endure change by shifting its behavior or habitat. A specialist perfected for a narrow set of conditions has fewer options when those conditions shift beyond its limits. And in the Permian world, specialization has reached a remarkable degree. The ecosystems are rich, but they are also tightly interwoven. Each species depends on others, forming networks of interaction that sustain the whole. Remove one element and others adjust. Remove enough, and the system begins to strain. What are your thoughts about this? Share with us in the comments section. It begins so quietly that nothing at first appears out of place. The forests still stand across Pangaea, their ancient forms stretching toward a familiar sky. The great herds continue their slow migrations, and predators still move with practiced certainty through territories shaped over millions of years. Beneath the surface of Pangaea, currents carry nutrients through layered ecosystems that have long since learned their rhythm. And yet, within that rhythm, something begins to falter. Not everywhere, not all at once. In certain regions, the seasons arrive slightly out of step. Heat lingers longer than expected. Rainfall, when it comes, is either too little or too much, disrupting patterns that have remained consistent for ages. Rivers swell beyond their usual limits, then retreat into shallows that expose cracked earth beneath. These are not catastrophic changes, they are deviations. Small enough to be absorbed at first by the resilience of life. But they do not pass, they persist. Across different parts of the world, subtle anomalies begin to accumulate. Temperatures rise by degrees that seem insignificant in isolation, yet are enough to shift the balance of ecosystems finely tuned to narrow ranges. In some areas, vegetation struggles to recover between seasonal extremes. Growth slows, density thins. Herbivores adjust, moving farther, feeding longer, expending more energy to sustain themselves. Predators follow. The system compensates, but it is no longer effortless. In the oceans, the changes are even more difficult to detect and more consequential. Surface waters begin to warm, altering the delicate exchange between atmosphere and sea. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, and while the difference is slight, it begins to affect the distribution of life below. Certain regions become less hospitable, pushing species to migrate, to cluster in areas where conditions remain within tolerable limits. Currents, too, begin to shift. The vast circulatory system of the ocean, driven by temperature gradients and salinity differences, responds to even minor imbalances. Nutrient flows are altered. Areas that once supported dense populations begin to thin, while others experience temporary surges. These changes ripple outward, not as a collapse, but as a rearrangement. Yet within that rearrangement lies a warning. Because the stability of these systems depends not just on their ability to adapt, but on the predictability of the forces acting upon them. And predictability is beginning to erode. The chemistry of the atmosphere is shifting almost imperceptibly. Carbon dioxide levels begin to rise, though not yet to extremes. The cause is not immediately visible from the surface, but the effects are measurable in the gradual warming of the planet. A warming that does not reverse, a warming that continues. And deep beneath the surface, far beyond the reach of ecosystems and evolution, the source of these changes begins to take form. Beneath what will one day be known as the Siberian traps, the Earth's crust is under strain. The mantle below is in motion, not in sudden bursts, but in slow, relentless currents of heat and material rising toward the surface. Over time, this movement concentrates energy beneath a specific region, creating a zone of pressure that continues to build. Magma gathers. It does not erupt immediately. It pools, expands, and forces its way into fractures within the crust. These fractures widen, extending upward and outward, forming pathways that will eventually connect the deep interior of the planet to its surface. But for now, they remain hidden. The pressure increases, and with it, the potential for release. This is not an event that announces itself with a single moment of rupture. It is a process unfolding over thousands of years, each stage building upon the last. The crust weakens, not visibly, but structurally. The boundary between what is contained and what will escape becomes thinner, closer. At the surface, life continues to respond to the symptoms, unaware of the cause. Localized die-offs begin to occur. In certain regions, species that were once abundant decline unexpectedly, not everywhere. Only in pockets scattered across the landscape. A population here diminishes. Another fails to recover after a particularly harsh season. Individually, these events do not signal catastrophe. They can be explained, attributed to environmental variability, to competition, to the ordinary pressures of survival. But together they form a pattern, one that suggests the system is under increasing strain. In the oceans, similar patterns emerge. Certain marine communities begin to fragment. Species that once coexisted in stable arrangements shift their ranges or disappear from specific regions altogether. Oxygen levels in deeper waters fluctuate, creating zones where life becomes sparse or absent. These zones are not yet widespread, but they are expanding, and they are persistent. The connection between these changes, on land, in the ocean, in the atmosphere, is not immediately obvious from the perspective of any single organism. Each species experiences only its own environment, its own pressures. But the planet is responding as a whole. Carbon cycles long balanced between volcanic input, atmospheric composition, and biological absorption are beginning to tilt. More carbon is entering the atmosphere than can be removed through natural processes. The excess accumulates, trapping heat, altering climate patterns on a global scale. The warming intensifies, slowly, relentlessly. And still there is no singular moment that defines the beginning of the end. No impact from the sky, no sudden shift that transforms the world overnight. Instead, there is a growing imbalance, a sense that the conditions sustaining this intricate system are drifting beyond the range that life has learned to navigate. The forests thin in places, the rivers behave unpredictably. The oceans begin to lose their uniformity. Life adapts, as it always has. But adaptation requires time, and the changes, though gradual, are accelerating. Beneath the surface, the pressure continues to build. The magma does not recede. It rises, expanding into networks of molten rock that push ever closer to the crust. The fractures widen, connecting deeper reservoirs to shallower layers. The boundary between containment and release is now measured not in vast distances, but in fragile barriers of rock. The planet is approaching a threshold, and when that threshold is crossed, the forces that have been gathering will not emerge quietly. They will not resemble the subtle shifts that came before. They will redefine the conditions of the entire Earth. For now, though, the surface world remains intact. The great synapsids still move across the land. The oceans still support their layered ecosystems. The illusion of continuity still holds. But beneath that illusion, something irreversible has begun. Not from beyond the Earth, but from within it. There is no one instant where the Earth changes. Instead, the rupture begins as a series of openings. Fractures in the crust that widen, deepen, and connect until the barrier between the interior of the planet and its surface can no longer hold. And then, the eruption begins. Beneath what is now the Siberian traps, the pressure that has been building for so long finally reaches its limit. The first flows of magma break through the surface, not as violent blasts, but as relentless, sustained streams of molten rock. Basalt pours outward, spreading across the land in vast, advancing sheets. It is not a single eruption. It is a system of eruptions. Thousands of vents opening across a region the size of a continent, each feeding the surface with a continuous supply of magma. The ground does not simply crack. It dissolves into a network of fire. Lava rivers carve paths through forests, plains, and ecosystems, consuming everything in their path, not in a moment, but in an unending advance. Entire landscapes are buried. Layer upon layer, the molten rock accumulates, cooling just enough on the surface to form a crust, only to be broken and overrun again by fresh flows from below. The land becomes a living field of heat, a shifting, unstable surface that never truly solidifies. This is not destruction by impact. This is destruction by persistence, and it does not stop. The eruptions continue for hundreds of thousands of years, long enough to reshape not just regions but the entire planet. As lava spreads across the surface, the Earth itself becomes a source of atmospheric change. The molten rock interacts with carbon-rich deposits, releasing vast quantities of gases trapped deep within the crust. Carbon dioxide pours into the atmosphere in volumes far beyond anything life has ever experienced. At the same time, sulfur compounds are released, gases that will have immediate and far-reaching effects once they reach the upper atmosphere. The air begins to change, but not in a single moment. First, it becomes thicker with invisible gases, each one altering the composition of the atmosphere in ways that accumulate over time. Carbon dioxide levels rise steadily, intensifying the greenhouse effect. Heat from the sun, once partially reflected back into space, is now trapped more effectively within the atmosphere. Temperatures begin to climb, slowly at first, then faster, then beyond the limits of stability. In the sky, sulfur dioxide reacts with atmospheric moisture to form aerosols, tiny particles that spread through the upper layers of the atmosphere. These particles reflect sunlight, creating a temporary cooling effect in some regions, even as the overall system trends toward warming. The result is not uniform. It is chaotic. Some areas experience sudden drops in temperature as sunlight is blocked and the climate destabilizes. Others continue to warm as greenhouse gases accumulate, amplifying heat retention across the globe. The planet enters a state of climatic contradiction, cooling and warming occurring simultaneously, stability dissolving from both ends. At the surface, life begins to feel these changes with increasing intensity. Forests that once thrived begin to struggle as temperatures rise beyond their tolerance. Soil dries, water cycles shift, rainfall patterns become erratic, with periods of intense precipitation followed by prolonged drought. Plants cannot adapt quickly enough to these extremes. Without stable vegetation, herbivores begin to lose their primary source of sustenance. Food becomes scarce, forcing migrations that strain already fragile ecosystems. Predators follow, but they too are affected, because the collapse of one layer of the ecosystem ripples outward, weakening everything that depends on it. In the oceans, the impact is even more profound. As the atmosphere warms, the surface waters absorb heat, reducing the amount of oxygen they can hold. Warmer oceans become more stratified, with less mixing between surface and deeper layers. This limits the replenishment of oxygen in the depths. Meanwhile, the influx of nutrients from disrupted land systems alters the balance of marine life, triggering blooms in some areas and die-offs in others. But the most critical change is the loss of oxygen itself. Large portions of the ocean begin to experience oxygen depletion, regions where life can no longer survive. These zones expand over time, pushing marine organisms into increasingly narrow bands where conditions remain viable. The once thriving networks of marine ecosystems begin to fracture, and beneath all of this, the eruptions continue. Lava does not cease, it does not slow. It continues to pour across the land, feeding into the atmosphere a constant stream of gases that reinforce the changes already underway. Carbon dioxide accumulates, heat builds, the greenhouse effect intensifies further, trapping even more energy within the Earth's atmosphere. This is no longer a system in balance. It is a system in feedback. Each change amplifies the next. Warming releases more gases. More gases drive further warming. Ecosystems weaken. Weaker ecosystems absorb less carbon. Less carbon absorption allows atmospheric levels to rise even further. The process accelerates, not instantly, but inexorably. From the perspective of the surface, there is no singular event that marks the beginning of this collapse. Instead, there is a growing awareness that the conditions sustaining life are becoming increasingly unstable. Seasons become less predictable. Habitats shrink, Species decline not in isolation but in waves. Extinctions begin to occur at a scale that dwarfs anything in the history of the planet up to this point. And yet, even as life struggles, the Earth itself shows no sign of stopping. The eruptions continue, the basalt flows continue to spread, new fissures open, old ones widen. The Siberian landscape becomes a vast, interconnected field of volcanic activity, a system so large and so sustained that it effectively reshapes the entire planetary climate. This is not a localized disaster, it is a planetary transformation, and it unfolds over a timescale that allows its effects to permeate every corner of the biosphere. Forests vanish, oceans lose oxygen, atmospheric chemistry shifts, temperatures rise beyond the limits that many species can tolerate. What once felt like a stable, enduring world is now revealed to be something far more fragile than it appeared. Because the very systems that once sustained life are now being overwhelmed by forces from within the planet itself. There is no escape, no region untouched by the changes, no ecosystem immune to the consequences. The eruptions do not target life, they simply continue, and in continuing they reshape the conditions upon which life depends. This is how a continent ends, not in a single explosion, but in a prolonged, overwhelming release of the planet's internal energy, a force so vast, so sustained that it transforms the Earth itself. And as the flows of magma spread, as the gases fill the atmosphere, as the heat intensifies, the world begins to cross a threshold from which recovery is no longer certain. What begins as a regional disturbance becomes a global transformation. One of the first and most immediate changes is the introduction of vast quantities of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. As these gases rise and interact with moisture, they form sulfuric acid, creating widespread acid rain that begins to fall across continents and oceans alike. The rain itself becomes corrosive. It seeps into soil, alters water chemistry, and damages plant tissues directly. Leaves burn under its influence. Roots absorb toxic compounds. Forests that once stood resilient begin to weaken from within, their ability to sustain growth slowly undermined by something as simple and as pervasive as rain. At the same time, another gas is building in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide. Unlike sulfur dioxide, which produces immediate and visible effects, carbon dioxide works on a slower but far more enduring scale. It traps heat, altering the planet's energy balance. As more of it accumulates, less heat escapes into space. The Earth begins to warm. At first, the increase is measured in fractions of a degree, subtle, almost imperceptible. But the warming does not stop. It continues. Gradually, then more rapidly, the average global temperature rises by several degrees. This may seem small in absolute terms, but for ecosystems finely tuned to stable climatic conditions, even minor shifts can have profound consequences. Plants, the foundation of nearly all terrestrial life, begin to struggle. They are sensitive to temperature, to moisture, to the chemical composition of the atmosphere. As conditions shift beyond their tolerance, photosynthesis becomes less efficient. Growth slows. Reproduction declines. In some regions, plant life begins to fail outright. Without stable plant communities, the systems that depend on them begin to weaken as well. Herbivores lose their primary food source. At first, they adapt by expanding their range by feeding on less optimal vegetation by increasing the effort required to sustain themselves. But these strategies have limits. When food becomes scarce across large regions, populations begin to decline, not in isolation, but in widespread coordinated patterns of loss. And as herbivores decline, the predators that rely on them are forced to confront the same constraints. Energy flows through ecosystems are disrupted. The food web begins to unravel. Meanwhile, in the atmosphere, another process may be unfolding. one that is far more difficult to detect but potentially even more dangerous. Methane. Locked within deep ocean sediments under stable conditions, methane remains trapped as long as temperature and pressure remain within certain bounds. But as the planet warms, those conditions begin to change. In some regions, methane hydrates destabilize, releasing this potent greenhouse gas into the environment. Methane is far more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide, even if it exists in smaller quantities. Its release amplifies the warming already underway, accelerating the process in ways that compound the existing imbalance. This is the nature of feedback. Each change reinforces the next. Each system becomes less stable as it reacts to the disruptions imposed upon it. And all of this is happening at once. Sulfur compounds creating acid rain. Carbon dioxide intensifying the greenhouse effect. Methane amplifying warming. Ash and particulate matter spreading through the atmosphere, reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the surface, while also contributing to cooling in some regions. The result is not a simple warming trend. It is a chaotic climate system. Some areas experience extreme heat, while others face sudden cooling due to atmospheric particles blocking sunlight. Seasonal patterns break down. Weather becomes unpredictable. Storms grow more intense. Dry regions become drier. Wet regions become more erratic. The sky itself begins to darken in places as ash and aerosols accumulate in the upper atmosphere, filtering and scattering sunlight. Days become dimmer. In some regions, the sun appears muted, its light weakened by the haze of particles suspended above the earth. Photosynthesis declines further. Plants already stressed by acid rain and rising temperatures now receive less sunlight to sustain their growth. The cumulative effect is devastating. Across continents, forests begin to thin. Grasslands shrink. Entire ecosystems start to collapse under the combined weight of these stresses. On land, the sequence of decline follows a pattern. Plants fail. Herbivores decline. Predators follow. But this is not a simple chain reaction. It is an overlapping collapse, with each level weakening at a different rate, creating instability throughout the entire system. In some areas, herbivores vanish before predators fully decline. In others, predators linger longer, unable to find sufficient prey, pushing them toward desperate survival strategies. But none of these strategies can counteract the fundamental changes occurring in the environment itself. Because the air, the very medium that sustains all terrestrial life, has changed. It is no longer the same atmosphere that supported the long stability of this world. It is now chemically altered, heavier with greenhouse gases, charged with reactive compounds. Unpredictable in its behavior, and increasingly hostile to the organisms that breathe it. Respiration becomes more difficult as oxygen levels fluctuate. In some regions, oxygen may decline slightly, but even small changes can affect large, active animals that rely on efficient oxygen exchange to sustain their metabolism. The combined stress of heat, chemical exposure, and ecological collapse pushes many species beyond their limits. Extinction begins to accelerate, not as a singular event, but as a widespread cascading process. Each species that disappears alters the balance further, destabilizing the systems that remain. The loss of one population affects others, creating gaps in the food web that cannot easily be filled. And still, the volcanic eruptions continue. Still, gases rise into the atmosphere. Still, the planet releases the energy stored beneath its surface. This is not a temporary disturbance. It is a prolonged transformation of the Earth's systems. From a world that once supported stable, flourishing ecosystems, to a world where the very air has become part of the threat. The sky is no longer just above life, it is acting upon it. And as the atmosphere continues to change, As temperatures rise and chemical imbalances grow more severe, the boundary between survivable and uninhabitable begins to shift across the planet, and in ways that no species can fully escape. The oceans do what they have always done. They absorb heat, gases, energy, change. For millions of years, the vast bodies of water covering the planet have acted as a buffer, a stabilizing force that moderates climate, distributes nutrients, and sustains some of the most complex ecosystems on Earth. From shallow reefs to deep-sea plains, marine life has flourished within a delicate balance of temperature, chemistry, and circulation. But now that balance is breaking. As the atmosphere continues to warm under the influence of the eruptions from the Siberian traps, the oceans begin to absorb not just gases but heat itself. And in doing so, they begin to suffocate. At first, the change is subtle. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen. This is a basic property of chemistry, but in the context of an already stressed system, its consequences are profound. As ocean temperatures rise, oxygen becomes less available to the organisms that depend on it. At the same time, circulation patterns begin to weaken. The movement of water, the currents that once carried oxygen-rich surface waters into the deep, slows down. Stratification increases, meaning that layers of water become more isolated from one another. The mixing that once replenished oxygen in deeper zones becomes less effective, and so oxygen begins to decline, not uniformly, but steadily. This process is known as anoxia, a state in which oxygen becomes scarce or entirely absent. And as it spreads, it transforms the oceans from dynamic, life-supporting systems into environments that can no longer sustain most forms of life. In shallow regions, the effects are among the first to be noticed. Fish that rely on high oxygen levels begin to struggle. Their movements become erratic, their populations decline as they are forced into smaller and smaller habitable zones. Species that once thrived across broad regions now find themselves confined to narrow bands where oxygen levels remain just high enough to survive. But even these refuges are temporary because the decline is ongoing, and it does not stop at the surface. In deeper waters where oxygen levels are naturally lower, the effects of this global change are even more severe. Entire regions of the ocean begin to lose oxygen altogether. These zones expand over time, encroaching on habitats that once supported diverse and abundant marine life. As these regions grow, the structure of marine ecosystems begins to collapse. Organisms that cannot tolerate low oxygen conditions are the first to disappear. This includes many of the species that form the foundation of marine food webs. Without them, higher levels of the ecosystem begin to destabilize. Predators lose their prey. Specialized feeders lose their food sources. Complex relationships between species begin to unravel. And in this unraveling, something even more dangerous begins to emerge. In oxygen-depleted environments, a different type of biology begins to dominate: anaerobic bacteria. These microorganisms do not require oxygen to survive. In fact, many of them thrive in environments where oxygen is absent. But their metabolism produces byproducts that are far more toxic to most forms of life. One of these byproducts is hydrogen sulfide, a gas that is not only poisonous to most organisms but also capable of accumulating in large quantities under the right conditions. As anoxia spreads, these hydrogen sulfide-producing bacteria begin to expand into regions of the ocean where they were previously limited. And as they do, the chemistry of the oceans begins to change in a far more dangerous way. Hydrogen sulfide can build up in the water itself, reaching concentrations that are lethal to most marine organisms. In extreme cases, it can even enter the atmosphere, spreading its toxic effects beyond the oceans and into the air. But even before it reaches that point, its impact is devastating. Marine life begins to disappear on a massive scale, not in isolated incidents, but across entire ecosystems. Reefs collapse as the organisms that build them die off. Shelters disappear, food sources vanish. Entire communities that depended on these structures for survival are lost in sequence. In open waters, plankton populations, the foundation of the marine food web, begin to fluctuate unpredictably. Some regions experience temporary blooms, while others collapse entirely. These shifts ripple upward through the food chain, affecting every level of marine life. Fish, reptiles, invertebrates, all are affected. And as oxygen continues to decline, the regions where life can survive become increasingly rare. Eventually, the oceans begin to reach a tipping point. Large portions of the sea become uninhabitable, not just for complex organisms, but for most forms of life. The once vibrant ecosystems of the ocean, the coral reefs, the rich coastal zones, the deep sea communities, begin to fade. What remains are scattered pockets of life, isolated in regions where conditions have not yet crossed the threshold into complete collapse. But these pockets are shrinking, and they cannot sustain the global system on their own. As marine life declines, the oceans begin to lose their role as a stabilizing force for the planet. The biological processes that once helped regulate carbon and oxygen cycles weaken, further accelerating the changes already underway. The loss of marine organisms means less carbon is absorbed from the atmosphere. Less carbon removal means more remains in the air. And more carbon in the atmosphere means more heat is trapped within the Earth's system. This feedback reinforces the warming that is already being driven by volcanic emissions. And so the oceans not only suffer from the changes occurring on land and in the atmosphere, they begin to contribute to them, but not in a way that supports life, in a way that accelerates its loss. As conditions worsen, entire marine species vanish. Not just a few, not just localized populations, but vast numbers of organisms across the ocean. In fact, more than 90% of marine species are lost during this event. A number so large it is difficult to comprehend. Not just a reduction, but a near total collapse of marine biodiversity. The oceans, once teeming with complexity, diversity, and motion, become something fundamentally different. Silence replaces activity. Stillness replaces movement. The intricate networks that once defined marine ecosystems are gone, and in their place, vast stretches of water remain that are largely devoid of life. The transformation is not immediate. It unfolds over time, driven by the relentless expansion of anoxic zones, the spread of toxic gases, and the continued warming of the planet. But the result is unmistakable. The oceans have changed irreversibly, from a world full of life to a system on the edge of collapse. And as the seas grow quieter, as their ecosystems fade into absence, the impact of this loss extends far beyond the water itself. Because the oceans are not separate from the rest of the planet, they are part of it. And when they begin to fail, the consequences are global. What do you think about this phenomenon so far? Share your feelings in the comments section and share it with those who might be interested in this pre-dinosaur world. The land does not collapse in a single visible moment. It collapses in layers. First, the plants, then the herbivores, then the predators, and finally, the silent spaces where entire ecosystems once stood. Across the vast expanse of Pangaea, forests begin to fail under the combined pressures of acid rain, rising temperatures, and atmospheric instability. Trees that once towered over ancient landscapes lose their ability to sustain growth. Leaves wither, roots weaken. Photosynthesis slows as sunlight becomes less reliable and atmospheric chemistry grows more hostile. At first, the damage appears patchy. A forest here shows signs of stress. Another there begins to thin. But these are not isolated events. They are early indicators of a system in decline. As plant life deteriorates, the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems begins to fracture. Herbivores, dependent on vegetation for survival, are the first to feel the consequences. Food becomes scarce, not in a single location but across wide regions. Species that once thrived on abundant plant life are forced to adapt to increasingly limited resources. Some attempt to migrate, others attempt to shift their diets, but these adaptations require stability, and the environment is no longer stable. Populations begin to decline, not abruptly, but steadily. And once that decline begins, it accelerates, because fewer herbivores means less pressure on plants in some regions, but also less regeneration in others. The balance between consumption and growth is disrupted. The entire system begins to lose coherence. And above this already fragile layer, the predators begin to suffer. Among the most powerful of these predators are the synapsids, dominant terrestrial vertebrates that have ruled ecosystems for millions of years. These include apex predators such as the formidable gorgonopsids, equipped with specialized hunting adaptations that once made them among the most efficient carnivores of their time. But power in a stable system is built on the assumption of continuity. The gorgonopsids, like all predators, depend on the presence of prey. As herbivore populations collapse, the food supply for these apex predators begins to diminish. At first, they adapt. They hunt over larger territories. They expend more energy searching for increasingly scarce prey. They compete with one another for the remaining resources, but these strategies cannot sustain them indefinitely. Because their bodies, like those of all organisms, are finely tuned to the conditions of their environment, and those conditions are changing faster than they can adapt. The decline of predators follows the decline of herbivores, but with a slight delay, a lag that reflects the structure of the food chain itself. As prey becomes scarce, predator populations begin to fall, not immediately, not uniformly, but inevitably. And as they fall, the top of the food chain disappears. The disappearance of apex predators marks a profound shift. It is not just the loss of a species, it is the loss of an entire ecological role. These organisms once regulated populations below them, maintaining balance through predation. Without them, the structure of ecosystems begins to unravel even further. But by this point, the collapse is no longer confined to any single level. It is systemic. Every layer is affected. Plants are failing due to environmental stress. Herbivores are declining due to lack of food. Predators are disappearing due to loss of prey. And these processes reinforce one another. As ecosystems fragment, the interactions that once held them together begin to break apart. Mutual dependencies dissolve. Feedback loops that once stabilized populations now accelerate their decline. In some regions, entire food chains collapse almost entirely. There is no gradual transition, no steady decline into a simplified ecosystem. Instead, there are thresholds, points at which the system can no longer sustain its internal structure. And once those thresholds are crossed, collapse occurs rapidly. Species that once dominated entire regions vanish, not one by one in isolation, but in waves, across continents, across ecosystems, across time. The scale of this extinction is difficult to comprehend without perspective. For millions of years, synapsids, including the great herbivores and apex predators, have defined terrestrial ecosystems. They have filled ecological niches, evolved specialized forms, and shaped the structure of life on land. Their presence is not temporary, it is foundational. And yet, in the span of geological time, that foundation disappears. The dominant life of an entire era is erased, not because it was weak, not because it was failing, but because the conditions that sustained it were no longer present. This is not selective extinction. It is not a targeted loss of specific traits or isolated species. It is a systemic collapse driven by changes in the planet itself. Temperature extremes push beyond tolerance levels. Atmospheric chemistry becomes toxic. Water cycles destabilize. Food sources vanish. Oxygen availability fluctuates. Every system that life depends on is altered, and no organism, no matter how well adapted to its niche, can survive when the niche itself disappears. In the final stages of this collapse, only the most adaptable species remain. Not necessarily the strongest, not the largest, but those capable of surviving in unstable, rapidly changing environments. Species with broad tolerances, flexible diets, rapid reproductive cycles, generalized traits that allow them to endure a wide range of conditions. These survivors are not dominant. They are not apex. They are remnants, carrying forward only a fraction of the diversity that once defined the planet. The landscape itself reflects this transformation. Forests are replaced by sparse vegetation or barren ground. River systems fluctuate unpredictably. Entire regions become inhospitable, stripped of the complex interactions that once sustained life. The air is still changing. The oceans are still struggling. And on land, the collapse continues to unfold, not as a single event, but as the sum of countless failures across interconnected systems. What was once a world of abundance has become a world of scarcity, and what was once a stable hierarchy of life has become a fragile remnant of survival. The dominant life of millions of years, the synapsid world, has not simply faded. It has been erased in geological moments, leaving behind only traces and the faint beginnings of what will come next. The world has not ended, but it has changed in a way that makes it almost unrecognizable. What remains is not the vibrant, interconnected biosphere that once covered the planet. It is something far more fragile, a collection of survivors scattered across a world still struggling to stabilize after unimaginable disruption. This is the threshold of the Permian Triassic extinction event, and at its peak, life reaches a bottleneck. Not a metaphorical narrowing, but a literal one. A reduction of biodiversity so extreme that only a small fraction of species endure. For every ecosystem that once existed, for every complex web of interactions that sustained life across continents and oceans, there is now only silence, or fragments of what once was. Forests are gone in most regions. In their place, sparse vegetation or barren landscapes stretch across vast distances. The soil itself is altered, its composition changed by acid rain, heat, and chemical shifts that have persisted long enough to fundamentally reshape the land. Rivers run through these landscapes, but they no longer carry the abundance of life they once did. They are thinner, simpler, carrying only traces of the complexity that defined earlier worlds. The oceans, too, are diminished. After the collapse described in the previous stage, large portions of marine ecosystems remain empty. Oxygen levels are still unstable. Toxic compounds linger in certain regions. And while some pockets of life persist, the diversity of marine organisms has been drastically reduced. Entire groups that once dominated the seas are gone, and those that remain exist under conditions that are far from ideal. This is not a world of recovery. It is a world of survival. Across the planet, only a limited number of organisms have managed to endure the catastrophe. These survivors share certain traits, not because they evolved in anticipation of disaster, but because their biology allowed them to withstand extreme variability. Small size, rapid reproduction, dietary flexibility, tolerance to environmental stress. These are not traits of dominance, they are traits of endurance. And at this moment in Earth's history, endurance is the only advantage that matters. Among these survivors are the early ancestors of a group that will later become profoundly significant, the archosaurs. At this stage, they are not dominant. They are not the rulers of ecosystems. They are not apex predators or widespread herbivores. They are small, adaptable organisms occupying niches that larger, more specialized species could not survive in. They persist in environments where conditions fluctuate dramatically, where food sources are inconsistent, where temperatures shift unpredictably, where ecosystems are no longer stable enough to support complex hierarchies. And yet, they endure, not because they are superior in a traditional sense, but because they are resilient in a way that matters under these conditions. In the aftermath of such a massive extinction, the structure of life is fundamentally different. The concept of a dominant species loses its meaning because there are so few species left to dominate. Instead, life exists in isolated pockets, small communities, fragile systems that are only just holding together. These communities are not stable in the long term, they are transitional, bridges between what was lost and what may one day emerge. Energy flow through these systems is limited. Nutrient cycles are incomplete, ecological relationships are simplified, and yet within these simplified systems, evolution continues. Slowly, carefully, life begins to rebuild itself from the narrow base that remains. But this process is not immediate. Recovery after such a catastrophic bottleneck takes immense time, millions of years. During this period, the survivors are not evolving toward dominance. They are evolving to survive. Traits that allow them to endure environmental stress are favored. Adaptability becomes more important than specialization. Flexibility outweighs efficiency because the environment itself is still unstable. Temperature fluctuations continue. Atmospheric chemistry remains altered. Ocean conditions have not fully recovered. And on land, the legacy of volcanic activity still influences the climate. The planet is not yet ready to support the complex ecosystems that once existed, but it is no longer in complete collapse. It is in a state of transition. And in this transition, the survivors carry the future. Each organism that persists through this bottleneck represents a lineage that has passed through one of the most extreme selection events in Earth's history. Not because it was the strongest, but because it was the one that could endure. This distinction is critical, because the species that survive mass extinctions are not necessarily the ones that dominated before the event. They are often the ones that occupied less prominent roles. Species that were overlooked in stable ecosystems but whose traits allowed them to persist when conditions became extreme. This is the paradox of survival, that what matters most in times of crisis is not dominance but resilience, not specialization but adaptability, not strength but endurance. And it is from this narrow foundation that the future of life will emerge. The early archosaurs, along with other surviving lineages, will begin to diversify over time, slowly at first, then more rapidly as conditions stabilize. New ecological niches will open, new forms will evolve, new ecosystems will take shape. But none of that is visible yet. At this moment, the world is still defined by loss, by reduction, by the absence of what once was. The forests are not yet regrown, the oceans are not yet repopulated, the skies are not yet filled with the diversity that will one day return. Instead, there is a quiet, a pause, a narrow corridor through which life must pass if it is to continue. This is the bottleneck, a point in time where the diversity of life is compressed to its limits, where only a small number of lineages remain, and where the future depends entirely on those few survivors. From this moment onward, everything changes, because life is no longer defined by what it once was. It is defined by what remains. And what remains when is enough to begin again. The new future is coming. What do you think about the new world? The world does not immediately feel like a world at all. It feels empty, not in the sense of silence alone, but in the deeper absence of structure, of complexity, of the dense interconnections that once made ecosystems feel alive and self-sustaining. What remains after the Permian Triassic extinction event is not a continuation of the old world. It is something new, something stripped down, something raw. Across the vast stretches of Pangaea, landscapes appear simplified to an almost unrecognizable degree. Forests, where they return at all, are sparse and uneven. They lack the layered complexity that once defined ancient ecosystems. There are no towering canopies filled with diverse life, no dense undergrowth teeming with interactions. Instead, there are scattered stands of vegetation, islands of life in a landscape that is otherwise subdued. The soil itself reflects this reduction. Nutrient cycles, once driven by a multitude of organisms working in concert, are now limited to a few remaining pathways. Decomposition is slower in some regions, disrupted in others. The intricate balance that once sustained productivity has been replaced by something less efficient, but more resilient. In the oceans, the story is similar. The vast systems that once supported rich marine ecosystems are still recovering from the collapse. Oxygen levels remain unstable in many regions. The diversity of marine life is a fraction of what it once was. Entire ecological groups have vanished, leaving behind gaps that cannot be immediately filled. And yet, life persists. Not abundantly, not overwhelmingly, but persistently. This persistence is what defines the New World, because although the biosphere has been reduced to a fraction of its former diversity, it has not been erased. It has been reset. And from this reset, something fundamental begins to happen. Evolution resumes. But not in the way it once did. In the Permian world, evolution operated within established systems. Species adapted to existing niches, refining their traits within relatively stable ecosystems. Change was incremental, guided by the constraints of a world that was already full. Now the world is not full, it is empty. And in that emptiness, evolution gains something it has not had in millions of years. Space. Ecological niches, the roles that organisms occupy within ecosystems are now largely unfilled. Entire categories of life that once existed have disappeared. Predators, herbivores, decomposers, and countless specialized forms are gone. What remains are the survivors. And for these survivors, the absence of competition is both an opportunity and a challenge, because while resources may be more available in some respects, the environment itself is still unstable. Conditions continue to fluctuate. Temperature, atmospheric composition, and environmental stressors have not yet returned to equilibrium. So evolution begins again, but cautiously, experimentally. At first, changes are small. Subtle variations within populations, slight differences in size, shape, behavior. Traits that may or may not provide an advantage depending on the conditions of a given environment. Some of these variations prove useful, others do not. And over time, natural selection begins to shape these populations once more. But unlike before, there is no immediate pressure to conform to an established ecosystem. There are no dominant species dictating the structure of the environment. There are no rigid hierarchies that define the flow of energy and interaction. Instead, life explores possibilities. It tests boundaries. It fills in the empty spaces left behind by extinction. In the absence of established competitors, even small advantages can lead to significant evolutionary change. A slight improvement in feeding efficiency, a minor shift in reproductive strategy, a small increase in tolerance to environmental stress. Over time, these incremental changes accumulate. Lineages begin to diverge. New forms begin to emerge. But they do so slowly, because the world itself is still stabilizing. Recovery from such a massive extinction is not immediate. It takes millions of years for ecosystems to rebuild complexity, for biodiversity to increase, for ecological relationships to re-establish themselves across different environments. During this time, life moves forward cautiously, exploring, testing, adapting. The world is no longer defined by the dominant synapsids of the Permian. Their legacy has been erased, leaving behind only traces in the fossil record. In their place, new groups begin to rise. Among the survivors are early archosaurs, which will eventually give rise to a wide array of future forms. At this stage, however, they are simply part of the broader recovery, one of many lineages navigating a world that is still in flux. These organisms are not yet remarkable. They are not yet dominant. They are simply present. And presence, in a world that has been emptied, is the first step toward everything that will follow. The absence of competition allows for rapid diversification over time, but that diversification does not occur instantly. It unfolds gradually as environments stabilize and new ecological roles become available. Each new niche that opens provides an opportunity for evolution to explore a different path. Some lineages remain small and unobtrusive, filling roles as opportunistic feeders or resilient survivors in harsh environments. Others begin to experiment with size, structure, and behavior, gradually adapting to new opportunities in the recovering ecosystems. Over time, these experiments will lead to the emergence of entirely new forms of life, new strategies, new structures, new relationships. But at this stage, the world is still in its earliest phase of recovery. It is a world without dominance, without complexity at its former scale, without the dense networks that once defined the Permian. It is a world that has been stripped back to its essentials. And from that simplicity, something profound begins to emerge, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Life is returning, not as it was, but as something new. The earth has been emptied, and in that emptiness, the future begins. The world that emerged from the Great Extinction is not immediately dominated by strength or size. It is shaped first by opportunity. After the collapse of the Permian ecosystems, the planet enters a new geological chapter, the Triassic period. This is a world still recovering, still stabilizing, and still defined by the absence of what once was. But absence over time becomes a powerful force, because where there is no competition, evolution is no longer constrained by the rigid structures of the past. And in that space, life begins to expand. Among the survivors that endured the bottleneck of extinction, one group begins to diversify in a remarkable way, the archosaurs. These organisms, once relatively insignificant in the broader Permian world, now find themselves in a radically different environment, one where ecological roles are unfilled and evolutionary possibilities are open. They are not the only survivors, but they are among the most adaptable. And adaptability in this world is everything. Early archosaurs begin to branch into different forms, each exploring a different path through the evolving Triassic landscape. Some remain low to the ground, becoming early relatives of modern crocodilians. These forms are typically ambush predators moving with patience and power, adapted to both aquatic and terrestrial environments. Their bodies are efficient. Their behavior is opportunistic. They are survivors shaped by restraint rather than excess. These lineages will eventually give rise to groups like the early crocodile-like archosaurs, which maintain a lineage of resilience through millions of years of environmental change. But not all archosaurs follow this path. Others begin to change in a different direction. Their limbs grow more vertical beneath their bodies, shifting from a sprawling posture to a more upright stance. This may seem like a small anatomical adjustment, but its implications are profound. An upright posture allows for greater efficiency in movement. It enables faster locomotion, improved endurance, and more precise control of energy use. It reduces drag on the body and allows for a more active lifestyle. These changes do not occur overnight. They accumulate over generations, each incremental shift reinforcing the advantages of a more upright, agile form. And within this evolutionary experiment, something remarkable begins to emerge. The earliest dinosaurs. At this stage, they are not the towering giants that will later dominate the Mesozoic era. They are small, often lightly built creatures occupying niches that larger animals either cannot access or have not yet adapted to fill. They are fast, they are agile, and they are adaptable. Their size allows them to survive on limited resources, an important advantage in a world where ecosystems are still recovering from collapse. Their agility allows them to exploit opportunities quickly. Their metabolism in many cases is more active, enabling sustained movement and potentially higher levels of activity compared to some of their contemporaries. But perhaps their greatest advantage is not any single trait. It is the combination of traits that allow them to respond quickly to environmental change. The Triassic world is not stable. It is still recovering from the upheaval of the extinction event. Climate conditions fluctuate. Ecosystems are incomplete. Food sources vary in availability. Environmental pressures are unevenly distributed across regions. In such a world, adaptability is not just useful, it is essential. The small dinosaurs, along with other emerging archosaur groups, begin to take advantage of the open ecological niches left behind by extinction. Where once large synapsids dominated the land, now there is space for entirely new forms to emerge. Herbivorous niches begin to be filled by early plant-eating reptiles, while small carnivores take advantage of available prey. Over time, these interactions begin to form the foundation of new ecosystems. But these ecosystems are not yet stable. They are still forming, and within them, competition begins to reappear. Unlike the Permian world, where long-established hierarchies defined interactions, the Triassic is a more fluid environment. Different groups are still experimenting with their roles. No single lineage has yet established long-term dominance. This creates a dynamic, competitive landscape, but also an open one. Because while competition exists, the absence of the former dominant groups means that no lineage is constrained by the same evolutionary ceilings that once defined earlier ecosystems. The stage has been cleared, and now new actors begin to take their place. Among these actors, dinosaurs start to stand out. Not immediately, but gradually. Their success is not sudden, it is cumulative. As environmental conditions continue to shift, certain traits begin to provide increasingly significant advantages: efficient movement, rapid growth, effective resource utilization. The ability to occupy a wide range of ecological niches. Dinosaurs begin to excel in these areas, not all at once, but across multiple lineages. Different groups begin to specialize in different ways. Some remain small and agile, thriving in environments where speed and flexibility are key. Others begin to grow larger, exploring new ecological roles that were previously unavailable or unoccupied. But even as these changes occur, the world remains in a state of transition. Recovery from the Permian extinction is still ongoing. Ecosystems are not yet fully developed. The climate continues to fluctuate, and new environmental pressures continue to shape the course of evolution. In this context, success is not guaranteed. Many lineages will fail, many experiments in evolution will not persist. But among those that do survive, dinosaurs begin to establish a presence that will grow over time. At first, they are marginal, small, unassuming, part of a broader tapestry of life that is still rebuilding itself. But as conditions evolve, they begin to occupy increasingly important roles within ecosystems. They are not yet dominant, but they are becoming more prominent. And in the long arc of evolutionary history, that distinction is critical. Because dominance is not achieved instantly, it is built gradually. through a combination of opportunity, adaptability, and time. The extinction event that once reduced life to a narrow bottleneck has now created the conditions for a new era. An era defined not by the survivors of the past, but by the possibilities of the future. And within that future, the dinosaurs are beginning to rise. The story does not end with triumph, it ends with absence. Because the rise of the dinosaurs, the beginning of the world many imagine as ancient and iconic, is not a story of inevitability. It is the result of something far more profound, a world that no longer exists and a world that had to end. The Earth does not move from one era to another through choice. It moves through destruction. The transition from the devastated aftermath of the Permian Triassic extinction event into the age that follows is not a smooth transformation. It is a fracture in time, a breaking point where the dominant rules of life are rewritten. What emerges from that fracture is the Mesozoic era, a world that will later be defined by immense diversity, towering ecosystems, and the long reign of dinosaurs. But that future is not born from stability, it is born from collapse. It is tempting to imagine that the rise of dinosaurs was always going to happen, that they were destined to inherit the Earth, waiting in the background while the Permian world unfolded toward its conclusion. But the reality is more fragile, more uncertain, more dependent on chance. Before the extinction, the world was already filled, complex, balanced, and dominated by entirely different life forms. Synapsids that had ruled for millions of years, occupying roles that would later be filled by other organisms. The Permian was not incomplete, it was not primitive, it was not failing, it was a fully realized system. A functioning biosphere shaped by deep evolutionary history. Its ecosystems were not transitional. They were established, refined, stable, until they were not. When the catastrophic forces of the Siberian traps unleashed their long, relentless eruptions, they did not merely disrupt life. They dismantled it. The atmosphere changed, the oceans collapsed, temperatures surged, food chains unraveled, and in a relatively short span of geological time, the majority of life on Earth was erased. This was not a selective pruning. It was a global reset. The consequences of that reset were profound. Because when a system is reduced to its most minimal survivors, the future is no longer constrained by the past. Entire lineages vanish. Entire ecological roles disappear. Entire ways of living are erased from the planet. What remains are fragments, scattered survivors, organisms that endured not because they were the strongest or the most dominant, but because they happened to possess traits that allowed them to persist through unimaginable stress. These survivors carry forward the genetic and ecological memory of the past, but they do not carry its dominance. And so, the world that emerges after the extinction is not a continuation. It is a reconstruction. Life must begin again, but this time it begins in a world with open space, with fewer competitors, with ecological niches that have been left unfilled for millions of years. This is the condition that allows new groups, including early archosaurs and eventually dinosaurs, to expand, diversify, and explore evolutionary possibilities that were previously inaccessible. The rise of dinosaurs, then, is not the result of superiority, it is the result of opportunity. They flourish not because they were always the strongest, but because the strongest, in the context of the Permian world, were no longer there. This distinction changes everything, because it reframes the entire narrative of life on Earth. It suggests that evolution is not a linear progression toward complexity or dominance. It is a series of contingent outcomes shaped by chance, environment, and timing. If the extinction had not occurred, the trajectory of life might have remained entirely different. The synapsids might have continued their dominance. Mammal-like creatures might have evolved along a completely separate path. Dinosaurs might never have risen to prominence, and the eventual emergence of mammals, and later humans, might have been altered beyond recognition. Or perhaps it might never have happened at all. This is the quiet, unsettling truth that lingers beneath the entire story. The world that existed before the dinosaurs was not a failure. It was not inferior. It was not incomplete. It was a world that functioned on its own terms, a world that sustained life for millions of years, a world that was, in every meaningful sense, successful, and yet it vanished. Not because it was flawed, but because the Earth itself was in a state of dynamic, sometimes violent transformation. The collapse of that world made room for the next, but at an immense cost. The loss of over 90% of marine species, the disappearance of dominant terrestrial life, the near-total restructuring of global ecosystems. This was the price of transition. And the result was a planet reset to near zero, a biological and ecological blank slate from which entirely new systems could emerge. The Mesozoic world that followed, the world of dinosaurs, was not a continuation of the Permian. It was a new experiment, one that would eventually give rise to extraordinary diversity. Massive sauropods stretching across ancient landscapes, predatory theropods ruling their ecosystems, flying reptiles soaring above volcanic plains, and in time the first ancestors of mammals taking quiet small steps in the background. But none of this would have been possible without the disappearance of what came before. This is the paradox at the heart of Earth's history. Creation often follows destruction. Opportunity often emerges from loss. And entire worlds may need to vanish for new ones to begin. The Permian world did not fail. It fulfilled its role in the long arc of life. It carried Earth to a point of profound complexity. And then it was erased, not as a punishment, but as a transition, a turning point in the story of the planet. The Mesozoic era rises from that turning point, carrying forward the legacy of survival, adaptation, and resilience. Dinosaurs flourish in that new world, not because they were chosen, but because they were allowed. And in that distinction lies the deeper meaning of the story. Because it challenges the idea that life moves toward a predetermined outcome. Instead, it reveals something more uncertain, more fragile, more contingent. Every species that exists today is the result of countless variables aligning across time. Every ecosystem is the product of both creation and loss, and every moment of life is built upon the remains of worlds that no longer exist. The final question is not about dinosaurs. It is about everything that came after. If the Permian world had survived, if the Great Extinction had never occurred, if the dominant lineages of that time had continued uninterrupted, would anything we recognize as familiar today have ever come into being? Would mammals have emerged? Would consciousness have taken the form it did? Would humans exist at all? Or would the Earth still be home to a completely different kind of world? One that we can only imagine but never truly know. The answer is not written in certainty. It is written in absence, in what was lost, and in what, because of that loss, was allowed to become. If this journey through our past helped you understand what it takes to survive, subscribe to Science of Survival. We release new documentaries every week, exploring extinction, adaptation, and the fragile line that keeps humanity alive.